Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this remote meeting of the Development Plan panel. My name is Councillor Neil Warshaw, and I'll be chairing today's meeting. Just going to go through my preamble discussion as normal, folks, so just bear with me. So I'd like to start the meeting today by confirming that the meeting is of Development Plan panel meets requirements of the Council's constitution, even though members of the panel are in remote attendance. While items today will be fully discussed as usual, remote attendance requires a few slight changes to how I manage the debate. Therefore, as you all know, folks, can you mute your microphones unless you're speaking? Can you keep your cameras running, please? And all participants will be invited to introduce themselves at the start of the public session to make it clear to public observers who will be involved in proceedings. Members wishing to ask questions, make comments, should do so by using the raised hand facility. And I will strongly endeavour to keep a proper eye on that, folks, so no one's missed out. Great. So in order to minimise any disruption in case I lose my internet connectivity, my web hub is currently supporting this meeting and 2 other Zoom meetings, so this could go right at any moment. I'd like to propose a deputy chair, as we normally do. So I propose Councillor Ritchie. And can somebody formally second that motion, please?
I'll second it, Chair.
Much appreciated, Councillor Gruen. So Councillor Ritchie is our deputy chair for his sins. So I'm going to now do introductions. So I'll start with Councillor Anderson.
So Barry Anderson, Adlin Wharfdale Ward.
Councillor Arif.
Hi, Councillor Sam Arif Gipton, Hare Hills Ward.
Councillor Campbell.
Good afternoon, everyone. Councillor Colin Campbell here.
And Councillor Carter is not attending. So Councillor Collins.
Good afternoon, Councillor Dawn Collins from Horsforth Ward.
And Councillor Finnegan's not attending. So Councillor Gruen, Caroline.
Councillor Caroline Gruen, Bramley and Stanningley Ward. Thank
you. Councillor McKenna.
Good afternoon, everybody. Councillor Jim McKenna, Armley Ward.
Councillor Mulherron.
Councillor Lisa Mulherron, Ardsley and Robin Hood Ward.
And Councillor Kevin Ritchie.
Councillor Kevin Ritchie, Bramley and Stanley Ward. Good afternoon to everybody from me too.
Officers next, please. Mr. Carr.
Good afternoon, Jonathan Carr, Head of Development Management.
Mr. Elliott.
Martin Elliott, Head of Strategic Planning.
Mr. Feeney.
Good afternoon, David Feeney, Chief Planning Officer for Leeds.
Mr. Harvard.
Good afternoon, everyone. Adam Harvard, Group Manager for Policy and Plans.
Ms. Walker. It's a cast of thousands today.
Good afternoon, Nicole Walker, Legal Advisor to the panel.
Thanks very much. And Ms. Eunice.
Good afternoon, Nasreen Eunice, Principal Planning Officer in the Planning Policy Team.
Lovely, thank you so much, folks. Right, so moving to agenda item 1, Tash.
Thanks, Chair. Under agenda item number 1, there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under agenda item number 2, there are no items which require the exclusion of the press and public. Under agenda item number 3, there are no formal late items of business today. And under agenda item number 4, please can I ask members to declare any disclosable pecuniary interests?
Chair, I notice under later on we'll be discussing perhaps a policy change in relation to Leeds Bradford Airport. I am a member of the plans panel which will be making a decision on their planning application, so I thought I'd better note that now and say that whatever we discuss this afternoon may be relevant to a planning application, but I have not as yet made up my mind with regard to how I will vote on that. I think that covers me, Chair.
It does.
I think we all ought to do that. Colin has set the example, so that also applies to myself, Councillor McKenna, who is on the City Plans panel. Indeed, I chair it.
That also applies to me, Chair, Councillor Caroline Gruen. I sit on the City Plans panel and I have not yet made my mind up.
And I too, as Chair of DPP, I sit on City Plans panel as a member, and also I too have not made my mind up. Mr. Elliott, you've got your hand up.
Yes, Chair, just to confirm for clarity at this stage that the paper of which the airport is a part is around the scope of policies to be reviewed within the local plan update. No decision has been taken or direction of travel as to what those policies may or should look like. This is simply about including them and opening them up for consultation as part of that scoping document.
Okay, fair enough. That's really useful to know. Thank you, Martin. Right.
Thanks, Chair. Just under agenda
Yep.
item number 5,
Please.
apologies have been received from Councillor Carter and Councillor Finnegan.
Thank you very much. Do we have any substitutes? We don't, do we? No. Okay. Right, so folks, if we could turn to agenda item number 6, which is the minutes of the previous meeting held Tuesday, 3rd November and Friday, the 11th of December. I'm not going to propose to go through the minutes. I know you'll have read them, so I'm not going to go through them page by page. But are there any matters arising for the 3rd of November? And I'll just put my screen back from a Word document. And if there are no matters arising, can I have someone to move those as a true record?
Move them,
Members?
Chair.
Thank you, Councillor McKenna. Seeing nods, much appreciated. And therefore, are there any matters arising when we turn to the minutes of the 11th of December? I'll go back to my
Chair.
my Word document. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm struggling to get my hand function to work. Just for those minutes for the 11th of December, could I request 2 alterations, please, if possible?
Yep.
On page 16 in the HMO section, the second bullet point reads, whilst the SBD relates to new conversions only, that should instead read, whilst the SBD relates to new applications for HMOs only. I'm happy to send this through to Natasha, if that's helpful. Just further down the page, finally, the second to last bullet point, the 3rd line reads, with effect from the 1st of July 2021. That's in error, and this should read the 6th of April 2021. I apologise to panel that this wasn't picked up earlier, but hopefully that clarification helps.
Okay, no, that's really useful, Adam. Thank you very much for that. I don't think any members have any objections to those 2 amendments, so if we could note those, Natasha. Martin, is that a new hand up?
Yes, it is, Chair. Yes, just in terms of matters arising, I'm sure members of the panel will be aware that the site allocations plan proposed modifications for remittal in line with the High Court order has now commenced its consultation period for 6 weeks.
Thanks, Martin. Duly noted. I look forward to a torrent of emails and correspondence on that issue. So something to brighten my January up. Okay, colleagues, can somebody move those minutes as a true record as amended? Yep, members. Somebody has to move them.
I'll move them, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor McKenna. Hopefully you're all going to liven up soon. So if we then turn to agenda item 7, which is our local plan update, and as you well know, we're midway through our local plan review, which has got a climate emergency focus. So Adam's going to provide the latest further update on that. So over to you, Adam.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry, just let me make sure everything's visible. Is my audio okay? Can you all hear me and you can all see the presentation?
All good.
Great stuff. There's a few, I just want to say there's a few colleagues joining us that you'll have noticed here. We've got Paul Bingham, Nazreen Eunice, who's obviously going to do is presenting the second item as well. We've got Caroline Harris, Catherine Holloway, and we've got, I can't see the full list, I'm sorry who's on the screen. If we've got anyone else, I do apologize. We've got Helen Miller as well. Just say, I mean, these are the authors, a lot of these topic areas, and for any detailed questions that members may have, happy to bring those in to be able to respond to any detailed inquiries. So I just wanted to introduce you all to those colleagues. So thank you, Chair. We're obviously keen to hear the views of members on these topics, so I intend to take the report as read. However, we've prepared a sort of 10 to 15 minute presentation to help summarise the report and hopefully lead us into members' questions and comments. So without further ado, where are we now? As members will recall, we covered a number of topics back in November, which can be grouped into 3 broad areas really. We've got carbon reduction, green infrastructure, and placemaking. following those helpful discussions at DPP in November, we're working on consultation papers on these topics to aid consultees in sharing their views on the scope of the plan. Sorry, whilst the, I'm just going to skip through, sorry. Whilst the consultation papers themselves will likely run between sort of 10 to 20 pages each, we're developing plans on a page for each topic area, which will help simplify the material and focus on the key messages. And this is a draft of a plan on a page from the carbon reduction section. So that obviously considers the reducing emissions from developments and renewable energy generation. So it's just a way of trying to present these things in a bit more of an easily readable way. We're very conscious of comments that have quite rightly been made about plain English and the use of that, so that local people can get properly involved in that. We thought that plan on a page might be a better way of trying to synthesize some of these perhaps somewhat complicated issues. So hopefully that's helpful. Just going backwards. The new topics for discussion that we haven't covered so far, and they're still a very important part of the Council's response to the climate emergency, and these are flood risk, strategic placemaking, and by which we mean the sustainable growth of the city, largely in line with the 20-minute neighbourhood concept. And we're proposing to merge this topic with the detailed design aspects of placemaking. So we're considering placemaking at both the district-wide level all the way down to the site level, as a sort of a whole continuation of placemaking, because we believe that that is all placemaking, just at different levels. So we're describing that sort of district-wide level as strategic placemaking. And sustainable infrastructure, which includes the topics of HS2 and Leeds Station, mass transit, digital infrastructure and connectivity, and Leeds Bradford Airport. So by merging placemaking into its detailed design and strategic elements, that leaves us with 5 broad areas that make up the scope of the local plan update. And now we'll go into the 3 broad topics that are the focus of the report in front of the panel today. So the first is flood risk. Hopefully members will recognise some of those images, although not happy memories, obviously. Firstly, avoiding development in flood risk areas. Leeds has a strong policy framework for avoiding flood risk areas where possible, and this is based on a sequential approach which requires applicants to consider reasonable alternative sites in a lower flood risk zone. And for sites in a high flood risk zone, the applicant may also have to pass the exceptions test, demonstrating that the benefits of the scheme outweigh the flood risk and the development will be safe over its entire life. The strategic flood risk assessment defines flood risk for the whole district and provides advice on managing it. It also informs the policy approach taken in the local plan. Last updated in 2007, the SFRA is now in need of an update to take account of climate change projections, the flood alleviation scheme, and revised Environment Agency guidance. This process has begun, and it is hoped that the new SFRA will be completed by the summer. As a result of climate change, we know that the risk and incidence of flooding is increasing. Part of the Council's response has been to invest in flood alleviation schemes, as we know. But as part of this consultation, it's also important that we review our existing policies and consider stakeholder views on whether we've got the balance right on development in flood risk areas and explore options for how improvements could be made. Functional floodplain. Our current policy in the Natural Resources and Waste local plan is to safeguard land for flood storage, as shown in the SFRA. In those areas, only water compatible uses and essential infrastructure is permitted. As said earlier, we are currently updating the SFRA, and this will have a critical role to play in defining the extent of the functional floodplain. As a result, this may change the existing defined extent of the floodplain and impact development in those areas, particularly in urban areas not protected by the flood alleviation scheme. As part of the consultation, we're keen to explore views on the role of the functional floodplain, whether changes should be made to this in urban areas, and how this should be managed. Surface water flooding and sustainable drainage. As members will be well aware, SUDs can have an enormous benefit in managing surface water flooding, including reducing flash flooding, reducing pollutants entering local watercourses, improving amenity for local residents, and creating new habitats for wildlife. Current policy Water 7 within the Natural Resources and Waste Plan supports SUDs, but there are some difficulties in implementation, partly due to technical wording found in national guidance and technical standards. We'd like to consider strengthening existing policy to aid their use and implementation. And this could include mapping infiltration rates to identify areas that are most suitable for SUDS, identify areas where heavy rainfall can lead to flooding downstream. Linking across to other elements of the local plan update, we should explore further the role of tree planting in reducing runoff and ensuring minimum standards are appropriate and accompanied by ongoing maintenance. So for consultation, we would like to ask, do stakeholders agree with our approach to increasing the use of SUDS in new development, and do they have views on the techniques outlined above? Permitted development rights, particularly front gardens. This topic relates to the management of water, in particular surface runoff, but also to the management of nature. The loss of front gardens to tarmacking or artificial grass and paving can have negative impacts on flood risk by increasing the speed of surface runoff that would otherwise drain naturally into the ground. This is a complicated topic as existing permitted development rights allow for the paving over of driveways without planning consent. However, through consultation, we are keen to explore how we could limit permitted development rights on new developments to maintain the use of porous materials, as well as soft and natural landscaping. In addition, we would like to explore options for controlling existing development too, although this is likely to be much more challenging. It's important to note, I apologise, this isn't reflected in the report, but how those changes are managed with the use of the council's enforcement team, given existing resources, is obviously a significant factor and something we'll need to bear in mind as we embark in more detail on this consultation. The second broad topic is strategic placemaking. So current policies in the plan, in the local plan across all development plan documents seek to direct development to the most sustainable locations. In particular, the core strategy settlement hierarchy establishes a pattern of development which focuses development on the main urban area and major settlements, with a key focus on brownfield land as well. Through the local plan update, we're keen to explore how we guide new development to locations that offer the best opportunity for active travel, the use of public transport, and for the minimal use of cars. And this is fully in line with the draft transport strategy currently out to consultation. It is important to clarify that this topic will not review existing allocations that have already been found sound and adopted, but it will consider policies relating to unplanned windfall development. In so doing, and as expressed by members of this panel, we want to bring our policy suite in line with the 20-minute neighbourhood concept as far as we can, which itself aligns really well with a range of existing council priorities, including creating strong communities, inclusive growth, health and well-being, and creating sustainable infrastructure which reduces car use. One option to achieve this is to focus on planned development to areas where which have a high degree of sustainability. Other options may be to ensure that new developments deliver an enhanced service offer. And through consultation, we're keen. Well, we need to understand stakeholders' views on the 20-minute neighbourhood concept and how they think it would be best applied to Leeds. And the last broad topic area is sustainable infrastructure, which includes High Speed 2, Leeds Station, mass transit, Leeds Bradford Airport, and digital infrastructure. So for High Speed 2 and Leeds Station, HS2, Northern Paris Rail, and investment in Leeds Station are likely to transform rail connections in Leeds. We want to use the planning system to help us maximise the benefits that this investment presents for Leeds and minimise any potential adverse impacts, whilst also noting that many aspects of HS2 are not controlled through local planning policy, such as the principle of the development or its route. At present, there are no specific policies on HS2 in the local plan, so we're proposing to include one which could help guide growth of Leeds Station, identify development opportunities associated with a new HS2 line, maximise opportunities for green infrastructure, and maximise key pedestrian and cycle infrastructure. Consultation will therefore seek support for the principle of including a policy, but also capture views on whether our priorities for that policy are the right ones. Mass transit. Similar to HS2, it won't be for the local plan update to decide on the principle or the route of mass transit. This is a project led by the West Yorkshire Combined Authority in conjunction with the 5 authorities themselves. However, it is important, it's considered important that the local plan update does provide strategic support for mass transit in order to maximise the benefits of the scheme, such as integrating green infrastructure and active travel. In addition, it may also be appropriate to protect routes of mass transit from development when those detailed routes are known. And so therefore consultation will cover the principle of such a policy and seek views on what the priorities for such a policy might be. At Leeds Bradford Airport, as members will recall, and as noted in the report, as part of the full council resolution in March 2019, a commitment was given to review SP12, which is the primary policy for growth at the airport. It is important, therefore, as part of the local plan update, to seek views on how the policy framework as it relates to the airport functions, and any views on how that could be improved should be captured through that consultation. And finally, as a topic, we've got digital infrastructure of the sustainable infrastructure topics. So given how working life has transformed over the last few years, and particularly since March, the need for reliable, high-speed internet connecting homes and businesses is more important than ever. Improving this digital connectivity also has an important role to play in reducing the need to travel and thus reducing emissions. Leeds City Council's full fibre network programme is a key strand of this. However, it's also important to assess where the local plan policy can go further. Whilst existing policies provide general support for improved digital connectivity, we're keen to enshrine high standards for new development to ensure that technological infrastructure is planned from the outset of a development. This could include connectivity plans for all relevant plan applications to ensure connectivity is sympathetically designed into the scheme from the earliest stages. And consultation will therefore seek views on the principle of a policy on this topic and detailed areas for consideration. I thought it might also be helpful just to kind of reflect on how we see the local plan update fitting together. It's worth repeating the nature of a Regulation 18 consultation, which is designed to agree the scope of a plan. So broadly speaking, that's the topics and policy areas that the authority believes should be addressed by the plan. It's not a stage where detailed policies are fully worked up. Stakeholders have the right to comment on that scope, and those comments will then be carefully considered before the scope is set and detailed policies worked up further, and then we'll have further consultation on. It's obviously been endorsed through DPP so far that the proposed scope of this plan is how planning policy can be used to help address the climate emergency. The most likely form this will take is a selective update of the existing core strategy and natural resources and waste plan to insert relevant new policies or strengthened existing ones. So just to clarify, it's not the purpose of the update to revise all policies or to amend existing allocations or to create a new document. The rest of the plan will be left as currently adopted until future reviews. So finally, on to next steps. So as set out in para 1.4 of the report, over the next few weeks, we're looking to complete the 5 consultation papers, and these will be presented to DPP on the 2nd of March for comments before approval is sought to consult on them at Executive Board on the 17th of March. This will allow Regulation 18 consultation to take place after the local elections in May 2021. And that's the end of the presentation. So obviously happy to take questions and comments.
Great, thanks, Adam. That's on point and excellent. Thank you so much. I'm just scribbling some notes myself. Just as I'm about to ask a question you can't answer, so it's a good start. So theoretically, the Cabinet Office has indicated that the local elections will be in May, but obviously that might change. But it would be my opinion, I think that I wouldn't want the local plan review to be delayed by a potential delaying elections. And that's an area of concern, but it's not, I'm airing it now because I think it's probably been on members' minds as well, because things may change. I mean, things are rather fluid at the moment, aren't they, in terms of how government is conducting itself. Now the view at the moment is their elections are to go ahead in May, but that may change. But I don't know what other members think, but changing our consultation schedule puts back the local plan review, and time is rather of the essence. And it is, to put it bluntly in a public forum, colleagues, it is looking at climate emergency is perhaps not the most controversial topic planning's touched in recent years. Some housing allocation have been rather more controversial. So I don't know what other members think in that regard, but that's it's not really a question you can answer, Adam. It's just I just wanted to air it as a point to get across. So rather than you coming in to answer that, I want to bring in my speakers. So I've got Councillor Anderson's the first member to put his hand up. But Mr. Feeney, was that a question related? Your hands up. Is that related to the point I raised?
It was just an observation on it, Chair, if that would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, clearly there is uncertainty around, isn't there, in terms of what may or may not happen. I mean, certainly from a technical perspective, we are seeking to move the process forward and doing that technical work as we've been asked to do through this panel. I mean, clearly we'll keep going. If circumstances change and that needs to be adjusted in terms of the timing of any consultation, then that will have to be reviewed at that time. I think certainly for the time being, given the imperative that DPP has set down, we are wanting to continue as per what we've been discussing here, Chair. So I would much rather we kept things on track, and then if we had to defer the consultation, then at least the technical work has been done, and then we can commence that at the appropriate time, rather than delaying the technical work in case we can't consult at the current scheduled time, if that makes sense, Chair. Thank you.
It does, as long as we're ready for whatever happens, Chief Planning Officer, and I'm sure we will be. Right. On that note, Councillor Anderson, and then you got Councillor Collins, then Councillor Campbell.
Can I first of all say I welcome what's here, what's been proposed here today. Just a number of questions surrounding it. Taking the flooding one first of all. Again, this is in respect of my ward. I've had 3 major problems with flooding and the mitigation of it. And one of the issues that we have is that we don't actually have the expertise in-house in order to deal with professionals who are arguing against developments. So is there any way that we can get the policies written in such a way that the level of challenge by professionals compared with what the resource we've got, I think that it is a concern. It is a concern that, and subsequently it's been proved because the areas have flooded and residents say, well, we did say this was going to happen, but we didn't have the in-house expertise to argue against it. And the other thing is on the removal of permitted development rights for new developments. Fine, no problem with that in principle. However, I know I've argued in the past that we're building far too many new houses, but the number of new houses as a percentage of our total housing stock is actually quite small. And the major problem is actually retrofitting a lot of the houses that we've already had approved. And I'm told one way of doing this is an Article 4 direction. Is this something that the council are considering, or are there any other plans for how we would look back at the housing that we've got built and how we can control the potential flooding that would come from that? In respect of the 20-minute connectivity, do we mean 20 minutes by walking or by car? The reason being, if you take the outer northeast as an area, well, for a start, it'd be difficult to walk 20 minutes and you would walk into the middle of the countryside. So you would need cars, and that then becomes contrary to the council's transport strategy in terms of getting people to use public transport more. So I think we need a bit of clarity as to when we say a 20-minute connectivity, do we mean by walking or the ability to access those services by car, and making it clear what we actually mean. And then the final thing, and it's a problem I'm having just now with the airport, if we were to start talking about a potential change, does that leave us open to one side or the other then raising a concern against the council because they're changing their policy halfway through? Because depending on which side of the argument you're on, this could have a fundamental view on it. And the other thing is, when we're going out to consult on the airport changes, should we be saying what can and cannot be covered by this consultation? Because again, whether we like it or not, the national aviation policy is set nationally. Even if we as a council had a view and we all agreed on that particular view, because there is a national policy, some people might think, well, I want to raise this, I want this put in the policy, but we can't actually do it because it's actually a national issue. So how do we get around these particular points? Thank you.
Thanks, Karen Anderson. Yeah, when I was jotting down my notes for this meeting, one of the first things I wrote was the tension between local and national policies, and the airport does bring that to the fore. There's a lot we can't alter on that. Regarding to what members say or can't say, it might be an idea to bringing legal at this point, just to remind us what our responsibilities are, Nicole.
Yes,
Thank
Chair.
you. Sorry
I
for
think
dropping you in there.
it's no problem. I think perhaps colleagues from planning might be able to help better, because from my understanding of what this particular report covers, it doesn't go into or straddle across, if you like, the issues that are before the local planning authority in relation to the planning application. So that's the best I can advise with regard to the actual planning application before the council. I think it does depend on the scope of what the policy is likely to cover. Now, as Mr. Elliott explained at the beginning of the meeting, we're not into the scope of the particular policies, but maybe the planning colleagues can help out further as to what the actual scope is going to be, so that members have a better idea for the purposes of this debate.
Sure, that's helpful, Nicole. Thanks. On that, Martin, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So just to clarify that the statutory policy basis is set in the adopted core strategy for the airport with policy SP12. As per full council's request, that policy is open to update through the local plan update, but as yet no direction of travel has been set for that. And what this is doing is this is receiving comments and suggestions through public consultation on that. And it's important then to set out that the weight to be attached to any emerging policy will very much depend on the level of objection that emerging policy has received throughout its various public consultations. So at this stage, given that it is simply scope, it'll be difficult to ascertain what the direction and therefore weight to be attached to that scope is. But when it gets to draft policy status, which will be the next formal part of the local plan update plan making process, and the council approves a revised policy, at that stage, that revised policy can have some draft weight. But as I say, that will depend very much on its accordance with national policy and the level of objections and the nature of objections that have been received on it.
Okay, that's useful. That's useful, Martin, because we're effectively commenting on the scope rather than specific details germane to any application. So that's quite helpful, isn't it?
Right.
So hopefully that's clarified things for members. On that basis, my next speaker was
sorry, Chair. I think there's a few questions there from Councillor Anderson, which probably
sorry,
do with some
Barry,
response.
I do apologise. Sorry, Barry.
In terms of the kind of flood mitigation issues, obviously we have flood risk management colleagues who are experts in their field, and we work with those closely. In terms of how we write policies to ensure an easy understanding and robustness, well, that's the challenge of all policy writing, isn't it? And I think we're obviously very, very alive to that and very aware that we need to make sure those policies are easily readable and don't present perhaps too much in the way of perhaps backdoors. But at this stage, we're not talking about that specific detail yet. We're really just trying to grapple with the concept of the scope of this plan and whether these issues should be in it or not. You raised, Councillor Anderson, the issues of Article 4 directions, and ask whether the council is considering this. As you're probably aware, there's a huge amount of evidence that needs to go into creating an Article 4 direction. I think it's too early to say, given we haven't even begun the consultation on the scope of this plan, as to whether the council is considering that or not. I think what we need to do is get views back from stakeholders and see what direction the public and businesses and other stakeholders are keen for us to take. So I think that has to be our kind of open-minded position at this stage. In terms of the 20-minute neighbourhoods, walking or by car, it's certainly not by car. It's about walking, cycling, and public transport in that 20-minute area. But really, this is about a transition away from reliance upon the car. But we are obviously aware that there are lots of areas in the outer areas of Leeds that don't have that service delivery, and will struggle to demonstrate 20-minute neighbourhoods. And I think that's an issue we have to grapple with as part of this consultation. What does it mean to people?
Yeah.
And how do we get there?
Yeah.
And I think we've discussed the airport issue. So hopefully that addresses your questions, Councillor Anderson.
Yeah, it's really helpful. Is that okay, Councillor Anderson?
Yeah, the only question I'd ask is, what status will planning applications have that are about to be approved over the next few months, when we know that we're most likely to come forward with a policy that might restrict permitted development rights? How can we get wording put into these planning permissions that are granted that might not be built out for another 2 or 3 years? And so people are getting frustrated that, you know, new policies are being brought in, but we don't appear to be able to apply them retrospectively. Is there anything we can do that if we do come up with a policy and it is agreed, that we can put something in the planning conditions that we're approving just now to point out that, you know, the compliance with this may be necessary in the future? Because it might be another 3,500, 4,000 houses built before we actually get round to getting this particular policy put into place.
Well, Nicole will confirm whether I'm right on this one, and Nikki as well. But I think the short answer to that question is no. We can only use the policies as they exist in the adopted local plan to set conditions, and national policies set conditions for current applications. As you obviously are aware, we're so early at the stage of this that it's going to be some time before policies emerge, and it's only when they become adopted that we'll be able to use them to condition development. So whilst that is frustrating, that it means that perhaps a lot will be approved before that new policy comes in, there just wouldn't be the weight behind those new policies to justify inserting conditions on that basis. That would be my understanding,
okay.
At least.
Okay, fine. Okay, I tried.
Thanks, Councillor Anderson. So start that sentence again, shall I? It'd be worthwhile just clarifying for members, when do they attain weight? Is it purely upon adoption, or it's not? I mean, it's a little bit before then, but if we could get a fresh look on that. Martin, yeah.
Chair, if I could, and I just referring back to the answer I gave previously, that there'll be some weight to be attached once the policies are drafted, which will be the next regulatory stage after this, which we're hoping to accelerate, certainly toward the end of this year, where there will be some weight, and as I say, depending on the level of objection at that consultation point, and depending on that policy's alignment with national guidance. So that's the first route in a clear direction of travel. The second element to this is that these new policies will kick in both in terms of outline permission and reserve matters permission, so that it will be important for us, where we're considering outline planning permissions, to discuss with developers and notify them that these things are on the horizon. So this better quality and this ratcheting up of design quality, etc., will kick in at reserve matter stage, so that they're very clear from the off that they are planning for that. And secondly, and related to that, it's not just through the statutory plan that we can exercise these policies. We can encourage, we can set out good practice, we can highlight good practice, and we can also work with developers to discuss advocate the type of places that we want in Leeds. I think a lot of this consultation is going to be about capturing local residents' views as to what does the place they want to live in the future look like? Does it look like what you're buying now, or does it look slightly better than that? So I think this consultation is about showing people what that better might look like in a Leeds context. And I think those things together, alongside heightening the existing policies that we already have, do give us some tools to be able to get this agenda underway, and certainly point to a very strong direction of travel for it.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Marlon. Yes, I completely agree. It's about putting down a series of markers as soon as possible. Okay, that's really helpful. David, you put your hand. I want to bring Councillor Collins in, but is it a point directly related to what Martin was raising, David?
Just quickly, Chair. It was just to say that the other factor for members to take into account is that within the context of the planning white paper and the national changes to the planning system, we are expecting some legislation. I think it's currently planned for over the summer in terms of that process moving forward. And one of the features of the planning white paper, as members will recall from earlier discussions through plans panel, was to set national DM policies. So we need to see if that works its way through into the final proposals as part of those changes. But it may well be that there's something on this issue as part of that which is set nationally. But clearly, if it isn't, then that is something for us to look at locally. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, again, thanks, David. That's useful. Councillor Collins.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 3 questions or points to raise. The first 2 are the small ones. The first one is a water runoff. Can I have some assurance from officers that they will actually looking at the topography of areas as well, not just looking at flat maps? We've got 2 quite significant hills in Horsforth. We've got Hunger Hills and the Billing. And when it rains, the water comes gushing down the hills. So if we're going to have some review of what mitigation we need to put in for water runoff, I think we also need to make sure that we actually look at worst case scenarios within the city as well. Because I think just planting trees in Horsforth, 1, we don't own the land where the trees would need to go, and 2, it might not be enough on its own. So that's my first thing to raise. The second thing, the 20-minute neighbourhoods. I haven't done it, but I just want to be sure that when we say 20 minutes walking distance, that we don't contradict ourselves when it comes to the primary school placements. I know national guidelines say that small children shouldn't be expected to walk more than I can't remember, it's a kilometre or a mile. But we need to make sure that those distances they have to walk to their primary school isn't further than 20 minutes walk away. Otherwise, it just makes us look a bit daft when we're applying school places. You've got a 20-minute community, but you've actually got to walk outside of your community to go to school. So maybe some check needs to be done there. But the more concern, the item that concerns me more is when we look at this sustainable infrastructure list. I fully appreciate that this consultation has been brought about because of the climate emergency, and these are key bullet points that we think because of the climate emergency, things need to be brought forward. But for me, the sustainable infrastructure list is missing assessment of our current road networks. Our main arteries are already clogged and are going to get more and more clogged, the more and more homes and even businesses get built in the city. But we haven't had a review of those main arterial routes. I raised it when we were looking at the site allocation plan, and officers kept saying, oh, well, we'll do that afterwards, councillor. I seem to now see another list of things that we need to do. When I asked the question about the main arterial routes, again, it comes, oh, well, we'll look at that after. I mean, is it just that this is a really nasty nettle to grasp? Why isn't there something in the sustainable infrastructure list about our arterial routes? Thanks, Chair.
Thanks for those. I mean, just for myself as chair in terms of sustainable infrastructure, I mean, the way to make the arterial road network more sustainable is to have a more enticing and cohesive public transport and active travel offer, which is what we're trying to do through Connecting Leeds. The only way we're going to get the road infrastructure more sustainable is to get people out of their cars and onto public transport. I am speaking in a longer term post-COVID environment. That's the way to do it. I mean, there's not a huge amount of scope or desire from the administration, I think, for further road building, apart from relieving very specific problems.
Can I come back, Chair?
Yeah, sure, of course you can.
Yeah, because I'm not asking for more roads. I'm not saying we should be saying there's another road coming in. What I'm saying is we haven't looked at the shortcomings of our existing roads. Now, within the city centre, there are bus lanes, and there are areas where you could see that over a short distance a bus lane might be improved. But when you get out to places like Horsforth, we've got the A65, we've got the ring road, but there's no plan for those two major roads regarding even accommodating a bus lane. And if you just put in a bus lane at the moment on the A65 without actually doing any further works, the whole thing is going to gridlock with regard to the car. We can't be unrealistic and assume that if we swap all of our roads for bus lanes, everybody's going to leave the car behind. So that's what's concerning me is on the wider area outside the city centre. We don't have a plan for the road infrastructure, you know, even down to where the bus lane should go.
I would disagree with that from top to bottom. I think the approach that Connecting Leeds have laid out is a comprehensive whole corridor approach to prioritising public transport, cycling, active travel modes. But there is also, that has to be suffused with a sense of budget realism. So, for example, take Horsforth, as I live just down the road from there in Kirkstall, I know it well. For example, to put a bus lane down the A65, I put it to you, Councillor Collins, that you probably wouldn't tolerate the level of urban change that would take, because that would be comprehensive. Similarly, strategic bus lanes around certain other points around the city would involve a level of change that I think would meet with some resistance from communities. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do them, but I think we should be mindful of that is something that we would have to address as a council, including.
But that's what I'm trying to say, though, Neil. Is the moment there is nothing, no plan, no discussion, nothing to actually present to the residents of the outer communities to say, well, what if we considered doing this? Would you accept it or not? I mean, you're making a big assumption there that we wouldn't tolerate anything proposed. But let's have something proposed that we could actually then discuss, not just keep avoiding the issue. I mean, I'm talking about the A65 from the Hawksworth Road at the boundary with Kirkstall up through New Roadside, where you've got shops on either side, then over the Horsforth roundabout, and then up the hill towards Guiseley. Up from the roundabout up the hill towards Guiseley, there's potential to put something in there, but we don't even have a plan. We don't even have an idea as to what officers might propose for that area, and that's what I'm saying is missing.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Connecting Leeds programme is into phases, and I can't picture off the top of my head right now as to what phase the outer reach of the A65 corridor are in. But I mean, if that's not there already, it will come in due course. But there's also a certain amount of budget realism, I would suggest, into these approaches, and that's unfortunate. But after 10 years of local government austerity, and then the government hanging us out to dry during the COVID due to the financial impacts of the COVID pandemic, you know, we are going to have to be mindful of getting the most out of every public pound we have and how we spend it. At that point, actually, given the issues we've raised, and with all due respect to Councillor Campbell, it's probably a good point to bring in Councillor Mulherin as the exec board member, and then Councillor Campbell Thank you for being so patient, Colin. Lisa?
Thank you, Chair. I actually had raised my hand to raise some other issues. Are you bring me in to raise the issues I was going to raise, or?
Do both.
So, first of all, in terms of connecting Leeds, clearly the main aims of that particular scheme were to deliver on the local public transport improvement programme. We have already over-programmed those schemes, and in terms of the funding that was available within the envelope and timescales for delivery of that, they're all pretty much out to delivery now. We have got a number of other schemes that, because it was over-programmed, we're seeking alternative funding for. So both the Corridor Improvement Programme through WICA and the Transforming Cities Fund are delivering some further elements of those schemes. But there are obviously, in the size and scale of the City of Leeds, areas that we will have to come to through further schemes later down the line. And that's literally just because of the sheer scale of the challenge that we have. As the Prime Minister noted both last summer and when he was running for leadership of the Conservative Party and during the general election campaign last year, Leeds remains the largest European city without a mass transit system. And that is essentially the big issue that we all have in terms of delivering the sort of public transport improvements and the congestion relieving improvements that we need to see for Leeds. And that's essentially where we need to be. So we've got a transport strategy, which we are consulting on at the moment, which does include proposals for a mass transit system. But to be able to deliver that, we need the government to deliver on their promises. And the Prime Minister was very, very clear, not only last summer when he was running for leadership of the Conservative Party and during the general election campaign, but also at the Queen's speech after the general election last year, that there was a need to deliver. And he specifically mentioned Leeds in the Queen's speech programme that he set out. So clearly we've got a number of elections coming up, notwithstanding the concerns that the chair set out earlier in the meeting in terms of whether or not they'll be delayed because of the pandemic. But I would hope that with a mayoral authority and with the government having promised a mass transit system, that we'll get the funding and resources to deliver on that scheme for not only Leeds, but for West Yorkshire. Can I move on now to the issues that I was going to raise, Chair?
Yeah.
Thank you. So first of all, in terms of 20-minute neighbourhoods, something I really am very keen to support and see progressed in Leeds. This has been tried in a number of other large cities around the world, and there's some really good examples now that we can look at to learn from what's worked well elsewhere. And I think they're really good for members of plans panels, but also across the board really in the council to get training and some of the presentations that I've seen on the way in which 20-minute neighbourhoods have worked elsewhere. And it is about public transport as well as active travel, so walking and cycling. It's not just that you can walk or cycle to meet all your daily needs within 20 minutes of your home. It is including public transport. So I think that's something that would be really, really beneficial for us to have. I think in terms of consultation on the local plan, for me, I think it's really important that we are very clear what lies within the powers, resources and responsibilities of local governments, and what lies within the powers, resources and responsibilities of other tiers of government, whether that's West Yorkshire Combined Authority or mayoral authorities it's going to be, or national government. And I think it's particularly important to emphasise that. I mean, you've got in that list that you presented, Adam, HS2 and NPR. We've seen shifts on that recently, seemingly away from what has been promised to us previously from central government. We've got the mass transit system that we know we need, that the government has acknowledged we need. but which will be led from West Yorkshire rather than from Leeds. Clearly, we want to get the buy-in from the public to help to get the resources in and to be able to deliver that. But it will be, as stated previously, a West Yorkshire-led scheme, and we want to be able to influence that and where those routes will be, but it won't be determined here. And then in terms of the airport, again, as Councillor Anderson noted, the expansion of airports up and down the country is not controlled by local authorities, it's controlled by national aviation strategy. And the growth in airports is constantly hit with a big stick by very well-meaning members of the public on both sides, thinking that we have control over that. Now, we have to determine planning applications in line with the policies that are set nationally. And I'm very keen to see us develop our own local policies and the elements that we do have control over in line with the climate emergency. And clearly that's something that we're trying to set out in the scope of the presentation here today. But that difference in where decisions can be made must be made very clear in the consultation. Otherwise, the public are going to be very, very quickly misled in terms of where those decisions are made. And then finally, just to say, I think all of us are really appreciating the need for the digital infrastructure, particularly over the last year. And certainly those of us, Chair, who are struggling to keep our broadband going with our own meetings and homeschooling simultaneously has certainly tested my broadband capacity. I know it has yours. So yeah, something we absolutely need to embed at the outset of all new development.
No, thank you, Lisa. It's a really helpful set of comments. I mean, I agree entirely. So the consultation documents have to really set out clearly at what level decision making is, and this is what we can influence. This is what we can make decisions upon, and this is also. But then this is what we can influence at a national level, and etc. etc. It's really important points. Any officers wanting to come back on that? And if not, I'll move to Councillor Campbell, who has been ever so patient. And then after Councillor Campbell, it's Councillor Arif. So Colin, if you want to come in, please.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just quickly to touch on the schedule consultation. I don't think it really matters when the election is. We're hoping to move policy on to cope with that, to reflect our climate emergency declarations and later things. And actually, it's always easy to find a reason for not doing stuff, but actually, I think the consultation should go ahead in May. And I'm assuming that that's what we're going to agree today. On a couple of points, can I ask some specific questions, particularly about flooding? You know, Otley prone to flooding. It's raining a lot at the moment, and there's a flood warning out. So it's a subject obviously dear to our hearts. Can I just ask a couple of questions? Because we talk about effectively flood zone 3A and flood zone 3B. And kind of, 3B's active floodplain. I actually think we ought to be designating larger areas as active floodplain because it's a very effective way of storing water. But what I'm concerned about is that we appear to be saying that there can be some development in zone 3A, and I think actually I don't think that's a good idea because these are areas which we know flood, and the consequential issues associated with that are problematic, I think. I also think, given the comment which is in somewhere in the report, which says there's a measurable increase in total rainfall, total winter rainfall over the last 10, 15 years, I just wonder if we now ought to start thinking about the Zone 2 areas or the high risk Zone 2 areas, and say perhaps we should be discouraging development in those as well. I think I like the idea of linking strategic and local placemaking together, because I think there's a synergy there. The infrastructure is always one that will create some discussion, I think. I think HS2 and Leeds Station, well, we'll see where we go on that, because I understand that the funding for Northern Rail in particular seems to have been cut. The mass transit system, well, I can recall, Chair, when I first became a member of Leeds City Council, there was much talk about a mass transit system at the time. And I live in the hope that before I leave Leeds City Council, I actually might see a tram. But as you say, Chair, you know, the road capacity is what it is. We can't increase that capacity noticeably. We don't want to increase that capacity noticeably. So the only alternative is a public transport network that people can use. And at the moment, we haven't got one. We haven't had one for some considerable time. And hopefully, now mass transit's reappeared as a twinkle in somebody's eye, we might get a step nearer. Well, Leeds Bradford Airport, I'll leave for another time. But I think Lisa's comment in relation to the digital infrastructure is also important, because I think we need to be ensuring that developers reflect the increased demand for digital, I suppose, within developments. The final point, and I think it's something that perhaps Barry touched on earlier on, which is, I think it's clear to the members of this group anyway, and I think to most of the council, about the direction the council's travelling in relation to our climate emergency. And I think it is important that we persuade officers to now be slightly more proactive, perhaps, in talking to developers and saying, this is where it's going. It would be better if you started to think about that now, rather than at the point when we get the thing finally signed off, because it's easier to plan now. And as Barry says, lots of the developments we're looking at the moment will have 5-year build outs. And I wouldn't want us to get to a situation where we were still allowing housing developments to be built out in 5 years' time, which were nowhere near the quality and that we would require within a new development. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Colin. Mr. Elliott did. I want to bring officers in, but Mr. Elliott did allude to the fact that as soon as we've got stuff out to drafts ready for consultation, then those strong conversations with developers will be happening, and I'm sure officers will put it across very forcefully. In terms of David and Martin and the team, do you want to come back on the points raised by Councillor Campbell?
Yeah, I'll do that. If that's okay, Councillor Walsh. Sure. Yeah. I mean, just thanks for the comments of Councillor Campbell and Mulhern and Collins. They're all very helpful. I think, in particular, in relation to the question Councillor Campbell raises about flood risk, in a sense, part through the consultation can explore ideas of whether we should be, extending zones of 3B, and it may be coming out of the SFRA that's something that we need to look at as you reflect, that they can be really helpful in managing flood risk, and deliberately setting aside land for that purpose is very useful. In terms of the point about 3A, should we stop developments in 3A? That's where the question of balance comes in, because obviously we need to recognise that large parts of the city centre are in zone 3A, and when we balance access to services and facilities, those areas may very well meet aspects like the 20-minute neighbourhood really well, but also be in higher zones for flood risk. So there's a really delicate balance that needs to kind of take place there. And I think that's something that we're very aware of, and we're keen to get views on. because the alternative, I suppose, is to push development further out and obviously away from those flood risk zones, but they may also be areas that don't have particularly great services. Now, that's a very generic statement. There may be lots of exceptions to that, but that's the balance that we're trying to strike here. In terms of, I think the last point about discussions with developers, I think that's something that's going to be really important when we go out to consultation. And I think we need to make sure that we're engaging properly with developers. As a result of different inquiries, we've tried to kind of raise the issue of this. They were aware of it through this panel. You know, some of them will be tuning in today. I dare say. And you know, I think a lot of developers are keen to do this work, and we've seen a lot of good work from developers. And I think it's about bringing the whole group of developers forward with this. So yeah, you're absolutely right, Councillor Campbell. We need to bring developers with us. We're keen to do that.
Colin, did you want to come back on those? Because you put your hand up again.
Well, yes, Chair. I despair in some ways, because we know about the city centre. The city centre is already developed. I think what we're talking about is new development. You know, nobody's seriously suggesting that we stop all development in Holbeck and turn it into the flood zone for Leeds. So we're realistic about that, and I think within areas that are already developed, you have to have a slightly different approach to areas where currently there is no development. And I would assume we'd do that rather than, I suppose, simply say no in relation to the city centre. I am not suggesting that we say to developers, no, you can't do anything in the city centre. That's not the idea. It's about sites which are currently unused and about what happens to them. I think I need to make that clear, Chair.
Okay. Yeah, it's noted. Councillor Arif.
Thanks, Chair. Just following on from Councillor Mulheron and Councillor Collin in relation to digital infrastructure, I fully support that, because the pandemic has certainly highlighted digital poverty, particularly in wards like inner city wards like mine, Hare Hill. So it's absolutely crucial, and it's crucial that communities that are poorer in digital wise also get that infrastructure, and that's really important. So just really wanted to make that point clear, Chair.
Oh, very much agree, especially when we've got quite the population densities that yourself and I have in our respective wards. So it's important to reflect that in planning policy. That's excellent. That's the last speaker I have on this item, folks. So just to wrap up, sorry, I'm going to do some slight wee bit of computer work here. So in terms of outcomes from this meeting, Martin, what further do you need from us?
So thank you, Chair. So that's very helpful in terms of the right policy areas to be considering. So what panel can expect on the 2nd of March is the material that we intend to put out for consultation. So picking up on some of the points raised at this meeting and the previous meeting, this will be resident and local person and investor and developer focused to elicit a response about the direction of travel for these policy areas, and help then in turn create draft policies in due course. So I hope that members will hold in their heads this discussion and the one we had last November, when we bring the jigsaw puzzle together on the 2nd of March.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for that. That's really helpful, mine. On that note, I'm going to close off that item then, and let's progress on to our next item, number 8, open consultation, supporting housing delivery and public service infrastructure and changes to PD rights. So I'm sure this will be a short, concise topic. So.
Yeah, that's me leading on that, Chair.
Please, Nazreen, off you go.
So this is a government consultation. It's the latest government consultation, which the deadline for it is on the 28th of January. It relates to three main sections and all relate to permitted development rights. There are a series of questions relating to each of the three sections, and they are attached to Appendix 1. So what I'll do is I'll go through each section. I don't know whether you want to stop at the end of each section for questions or whether you would like to just wrap it all up at the end. In terms of, the general thrust of the consultation is about two things. One is about changes in relation to the high street and responding to those and extending permitted development rights around those. The other one is to do with COVID-19 and making sure that there is adequate public infrastructure in responding to, for example, the need for hospitals and schools. So if I go straight to the first area, so this relates in particular to the new use class E, which was introduced on the 1st of September. I think you'll all be familiar with the use class E introduces a range of uses which are commonly found on the high street, such as retail, restaurant, office, financial professional services, indoor sports, medical and nursery. What the consultation in particular is wanting to do is to expand this right, to expand the change of use to allow residential use as well. In particular, it's looking at two permitted development rights. Both of those do exist currently. However, the scope of them will change. So for example, firstly, from office to residential, which is class O of the general permitted development order, there is already a permitted development right from retail to residential, from office to residential, but it doesn't have a size restriction, nor is it applicable to listed buildings. The second permitted development right is in relation to retail and residential. So that's class M of the general permitted development order. Currently, there's a size restriction on those of 150 square metres. The difference between the existing permitted development rights and what this government consultation paper is currently proposing is that these new restrictions would go beyond. For example, restaurants, indoor sports, creches would now be able to convert to residential, and there would be no size restrictions. So the cap of 150 square metres currently for retail would be gone. So there wouldn't be a size limit on there. In terms of the prior approval process, a number of questions are set out, a number of prior approval criteria are set out, such as flooding, transport contamination, impact on noise, provision of adequate natural light, etc. But one positive to come out of it is, out of the consultation, is that the nationally described space standards would still be applicable. So in terms of our general response, the concern really is about Section 106 and affordable housing requirements. The prior approval process would not pick those up, whereas a full planning application clearly would pick those up. So in terms of figures, I've also looked at what impact the current permitted development rights have. In terms of loss of retail, to date, the uptake of this permitted development right has been fairly low. Since the introduction of it in 2013, we've only had 22 schemes with a total of 40 residential units. Clearly, the cap of 150 square metres has had an impact. The right which is likely to have a bigger impact is the loss of office to residential, which shows a more significant use. So since 2013, we've had 97 applications with a total of 3,877 units. So looking ahead, the trend could be that with increased working from home, that permitted development right could have a more significant impact on housing supply. The planning white paper, which is clearly linked with this, set out that SIL would be picked up potentially as through permitted development planning approval processes would pick up SIL. However, the same isn't said about section 106 and affordable housing. So that's a quick summary of the first section. Shall I move on to the second section?
Well, actually, thanks for pausing. Let's do. Members got any questions or comments at this point? Let's divide into sections, Nazarene. Just make it easier. I've been doing Zoom all day, so accommodate my brain. Just as a couple of overarching points from myself. Just as long as our consultation response, no matter what the question, reflects the fact that there are real dangers and concerns with mid-development rights. We're allowing other uses to go to residential in terms of design, quality, space, living standards, whether they're eligible for affordable housing, whether they're vulnerable for SIL, whether to get to brass tacks, whether they're fee chargeable for the planning service to be able to process these things, that kind of thing. All that we want reflecting as strongly as possible throughout the consultation response. I think elected colleagues and officer colleagues will be very, very aware of some of the problems that this has caused in London and other parts of the UK. It's when these PD rights were first opened up for office to residential, there are some frankly horrendous developments. The council colleague in London reflected this will just create the slums of the future, and that was a few years ago when they introduced. Well, those slums are now the slums of the future. They're now slums of the present. There is some movement to roll back from that in this, but it doesn't seem strong enough from my point of view. So we need to reflect as forcefully as possible that there needs to be some quality in design in this. I'm not opposed to the sort of the changes as a conceptually, shall we say, Nazarene, but in terms of the details, really important getting it right. And I don't think the government's quite there yet. So given those sort of general points, I've got Councillor Anderson and Councillor Campbell.
Just briefly, one is I found it difficult to actually look at this because I've not got a copy of the actual consultation document with us here. I've been trying to get a hold of it, but because of printing restrictions, I've not been able to get one because I'm having to use my own printer at home. So it's been very difficult. But that said, the points I would make in respect of any other, in question 3.2 on the papers here on page 49, I do think we need to emphasise clearly the need for usable green space coming from this. So I think we need to find a way of wording it more strongly. I'm not criticising what you've said, I'm just making the comment that I think we need to make it more clearer that we want usable green space to come from this. Otherwise, we will find people marooned, as happened in the first lockdown, that people were finding it very difficult to be able to access green space. Secondly, I think we need to make, what concerns me is the timings of this, because in the short term, I would think that we will have a lot of empty buildings in Leeds, depending how long it takes us to get out of COVID and to get the economy up and running again. And some people might want to bring forward some of these buildings for use as housing so that they can get a return on their money. But in actual fact, the best thing for the city as a whole would be to keep it as potential retail. But once it's gone, it's gone. And it's how quickly we can manage that particular issue, because that could be one of the... And then the final point is there any mention in the document about the size of dwellings that are going to go in it? In other words, are the government going to allow, it's usually something that Councillor Campbell picks up, are they going to try and squeeze in a whole lot of small units so that you can get, 100 units built, whereas if you were doing them on standard sizes, it would actually only be 60, for example, just to pick two figures out of the air. So is there anything, because I've not got the document, but those would be my initial concerns and comments. Thank you.
Yeah. Shall I respond to those?
Please, yeah, that's really it.
I'm happy to send a full copy of the consultation out. It is quite lengthy, but I think it does help in terms of understanding the context and the questions. In terms of the issue which Councillor Anderson has raised about usable green space, I totally agree. It's the fallout from not considering full Section 106 ask, which we would do through a planning application, which the prior approval process I think is in danger of losing that quality and consideration of issues which local communities would also bring in. So I will strengthen that side of it. In terms of the point Councillor Anderson makes in terms of empty buildings in Leeds and the balance of having an empty or vacant units on the high street versus units which are active but not necessarily of retail in the high street. I think as a local planning authority we try to protect our high streets, but we have to recognise that there is a changing landscape there. But in the consultation we do try to set out a stance which protects retail units where we can. In terms of the size of dwellings, as I say, the consultation does set out that the nationally described space standard is applicable, so hopefully that will assist. But clearly the prior approval process only considers the issues, the criteria set out. I think if the proposal to come out of this consultation is that a prior approval process is continued with, I think we should set out a wider range of criteria to be considered as part of that to get that qualitative angle back in.
I'm happy with that. Thank you.
Excellent. I think particularly points raised by need to be reflected in answers to question 5 and to question 6.1 in section 1 of the appendix, and it is very much worth raising that this could very much compromise our placemaking ability, and very much take on board Councillor Anderson's point about timescales where this too short-termist. But I also think add to that it's compromising so that our approach to 20-minute neighbourhoods and that kind of thing, and it's just needs reflecting as strongly as possible. I don't want to give the impression I'm not in favour of these PD rights, but I'm not really in favour of these PD rights. Okay, Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Chair. Barry, and you raised most of the issues I was concerned about. I think I do have some concerns about the viability of local centres if there is pressure to take out particularly shop units. And for Barry's information, it's actually already happening in Ockley. We've just had 2 applications fortunately turned down to take out a couple of retail units on the primary shopping frontage, turn them into residential. I think we need to flag up perhaps our concerns about the effect on the viability of smaller centres, because Leeds does have a number of smaller town centres, and perhaps make some reference to primary shopping frontages where we would discourage the use, particularly on the ground floor, of residential as opposed to shopping. Right, thank you, Chair.
Excellent and concise. I like that, Councillor Campbell. Yeah, I agree completely. There could easily be a rush to go resi with all of this, and it could really compromise, well, as we've before mentioned, placemaking, be it right, just viability of local centres at a time when all of that is rather in flux at the moment due to not only the pandemic but the huge shift to online and how that's impacting on things. And yes, somebody used the phrase earlier, when it's gone, it's gone. Well, yeah, I think that's because residential can be such high value in terms of income, then getting that back to something to make a local centre more viable would be rather difficult. And I just think that one of the most useful things you can do when you're making public policy is to think about consequences. And at the moment, from my point of view, there's not enough consequential thinking going on in the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. And I think that needs to be reflected in our consultation response, because I think that they need to think these things through rather more. Councillor Gruen, you got your hand up.
Thanks. I've only just put it up. I think others might have put it up before me, unless they're up, Chair.
You're absolutely next.
So it was just a question, and forgive me if I haven't read the meaning into the paper. On the first proposal, then, the change of use with this new Class E, presumably this refers only to the change of use, not the building. So if there was any change needed to happen to the building, that would not be allowed without permitted development. Is that correct, Nasreen?
Yeah, the change of this is about introducing a use class E, which allows uses to change, but any works in relation to physical works still require appropriate consent.
Okay, so if there was a proposal to change either some industrial use building into housing or homes of some kind, and ordinarily we wouldn't consider the frontage of the building or the construction or the design of the building appropriate or suitable for housing, is there anything the planning authority could do about that?
Yeah, I mean, the issue here is because the use classes order allows a flexibility between those uses, so it doesn't constitute development. It strips down the powers of the local planning authority to only be able to focus on certain issues, such as shop frontages. I mean, it may be, Jonathan, do you want to add anything in terms of the DM issues on that?
Yes, if I may, I think the issue is that we tend to get the applications in for the change of use first of all, without necessarily including all the physical alterations which tend to follow on. And once the principle is established, then there's very little we can do in terms of controlling the external changes to try and prevent the use in principle. That's the pattern that we tend to find.
So basically, I could turn a tin warehouse into a dwelling.
Well, that has happened, unfortunately, in the past. I think, as Councillor Walshaw alluded to, in certain parts of the country, we've found extremely, from our perspective, unsuitable buildings being converted into residential use. I think the intention of this paper is or the government's intention is to try and address some of those issues, but I think the problem is that there are still many outstanding issues that go unresolved.
It doesn't address that particular issue then. That remains unresolved. I think it's an absolute disgrace.
It is quite literally an absolute disgrace, Caroline. You're absolutely right. The government's approach doesn't reflect the issues, the seriousness of the issues. I would anticipate, if we looked at other colleagues' responses from around the country, particularly London boroughs, of all political hues, I think they'll probably have very much similar things to what ours have in. This is not a popular policy direction amongst local government from central government. I think the only people this is popular with are certain types of property developers and commercial landlords. Gosh, whatever could that be? Right, folks, I think we're done. I believe. I think that's our last substantive item. If anyone wants to raise anything else,
I have just got on that same paper. Two more sections. One is only very, very small.
Sorry, Nasreen, just to say that it's like Zoom brain. I apologise, colleagues. Do you know what? I actually genuinely thought I'd convinced myself we'd finish the paper right now. So please, we can do the next section. We'll stop after each section for questions.
Yeah. So the second section, and again, this is the most substantive bit, really, is about the provision of supporting public service infrastructure. What the consultation is looking at is planning reforms to speed up the delivery of schools, colleges, hospitals, and other NHS buildings. There's two strands to it. One is about existing sites and existing permitted development rights, and the second strand is about new sites and faster decision making around that. So, I mean, I won't go into all of the existing permitted development rights, but there are for schools some permitted development rights which total up to 100 square meters or 25% of the footprint of the building. What this proposal is doing is taking that to the next level, proposing up to 250 square meters or 25%, a slight increase in height as well. To benefit from the right, the site should have sufficient land to build the extension, and also school playing fields should remain protected. So that's a positive. Prisons for the first time will enjoy the same permitted development rights as schools and other public infrastructure. In terms of, that's about existing, that's about widening permitted development rights. In terms of new public infrastructure, a faster planning application process is proposed, which is what the government are saying is that local planning authorities can sometimes take up to 16 weeks to determine these large items of public infrastructure, and that isn't acceptable, and that should now, they're proposing that goes down to 10 weeks. So these public infrastructure projects will be taken out of the scope of major development. A new scope will be identified, which is looking at fast tracking that, speeding decision making. Another proposal is also that the 21-day statutory public consultation period will be reduced down to 14 days. Also, discharge of planning conditions will again be fast tracked, that these planning applications need to be prioritised over other planning applications so that they're delivered. There's also a proposal that the Secretary of State be identified by the local planning authority at the outset as to when the local planning authority feel that these planning applications can be determined. So in terms of our the response to that, there are a number of issues. I mean, often these sites, school sites, are quite tight sites within tight urban grain, you know, surrounded by residential areas. An increase, say, up to 25% for a school, whilst it could be quite, the impact on amenity could be quite significant. For example, an extension could really could introduce a need for a car park. If that hasn't been planned in through a prior approval process, then the car parking then spills out into the surrounding area. The proposal to reduce down the consultation period down to 14 days, I think we don't support. I don't think that gives the community adequate time to consult on what could be quite significant issues in terms of amenity. So if there's any comments on that, I'm happy to take, or questions.
Thanks, Nazreen. Yeah, support your approach you've taken. I think Councillor Campbell's indicated he wants to speak.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's an afternoon for nostalgia because, again, when well, I'm going back to when I first became a member of Leeds City Council. In those days, you may not remember it.
Mr. Chamberlain was Prime Minister, wasn't he? I don't know.
No, his predecessor we're talking. The hospitals in those days had a thing called Crown immunity, which in effect allowed them to do whatever they liked. And for those councillors who represented wards with hospitals, particularly St James's and the LGI, it caused horrendous problems because buildings were stuck up, nobody ever produced any car parking, nobody thought about access and all this sort of thing. And eventually we
prisons too, Colin, I might add. There's one in my ward.
Yeah, true. Sorry, I forgot about that. But we eventually persuaded government, all local authorities, government, that actually Crown immunity wasn't a good idea because there was effectively no planning control. And I worry that we might go back to that. Now, I'm not 100%, other than prisons, which are always unpopular with everybody, I'm not sure that there really is that much of a delay on dealing with these applications. And you know, to say it's taking 16 weeks to do it, well, some of these applications are really big and really complex. And the idea that we should just forget about the fine detail seems to me a little strange. I think Mr. Feeney will support me in this. Actually, if you look at some of the big applications that take a long time, it's actually the developer who's the problem, not the council. I would agree with the comment in relation to cutting the public consultation. I mean, we get complaints now that 21 days is not long enough. 14 days strikes me as basically saying to the public, well, you've got to be really, really, really quick on your feet. Actually, we're not that interested in what you think. So that's my point, Chair.
Yeah, I very much agree. It just seems unnecessary. I'm not sure where these public sector projects have been delayed, it's probably not through the planning system. Delays to health and education projects, particularly education, might be to do with a complete fragmentation in the education planning system, as those of us who went through the SAP inquiry will have had aptly demonstrated to us on numerous occasions. If that could be reflected in comments, Nazreen, that'd be really, really helpful. I mean, that's where the real problem, like the planning system seems to be used as a bit of a sort of a punch bag for actually other other public policy problems, if you like, systemic problems. And I think that's a bit reflected in here. Any more questions on that section? Then we can, oh, sorry, Mr. Feeney.
Just a couple of points, Chair. We probably should say that not all developers are responsible for delays, although it can happen on some occasions. But in terms of your point, Councillor Walshaw, that you've just made, I think that's a fair comment, that often planning is a process which is seeking to deliver the outcomes of other related public bodies' ambitions in terms of their strategic estate or delivery. And that's both, coming back to Councillor Mulheron's point before about what level of influence are we dealing with here? Is it local, regional or national? And I think it's fair to say that certainly planning has been caught in the crossfire of the funding arrangements around school infrastructure, for example, where we're chasing funding from Department of Education and how that aligns with a planning timetable in terms of an application coming through the system. And also it's the same of major transport infrastructure as well with the Department for Transport. There's an issue there about the alignment of the processes and approvals that are necessary through those departments and how they relate to policy through CLG. And I think to some extent the position is made more complex also by other agencies, people such as health bodies, and also agencies such as Homes England, each of those running to particular timetables and imperatives in terms of how they're operating their funding or their approval processes. So I think there's a question here about alignment, and it isn't planning necessarily that's part of the problem. Often planning is part of the solution in trying to coordinate and to synthesize these different drivers at a local level and making up for that lack of alignment elsewhere. So I think that's a fair comment to make, Chair.
Yes, yours was actually more eloquently put than mine. Not for the first time over the last either. But yeah, that's exactly so, isn't it? So let's make sure we reflect that in our submission.
Shall I just move on to the next?
Please, yes.
This is short and sweet now. So this is the consolidation and simplification of existing PD rights. What the government are saying is, because there's so many extensive permitted development rights, and then the new E-class has also been introduced, that's now made it quite complex and quite complicated, especially when the general permitted development order is still referring to old use classes, and then we've got a new use class which has already been in place since the 1st of September. What they're proposing is a consolidation of all of the PD rights into one document, which makes it simpler to read. The only issue that you may want to comment on in that is that the consultation also states that whilst rationalising these, the opportunity may be taken to widen permitted development rights further. Now, in response to that, the consultation response to that is that any widening of permitted development rights need to be the subject of appropriate consultation with local planning authorities and others.
Yeah, strongly agree.
Yeah.
Oh, very much so. It's that's a sort of an amber flashing light and no mistake, isn't it? Really, PD rights do not require any further widening. Quite the opposite. That's a really strong section. Thanks, Nazreen. Members got any comments on that section? Anything further to add on this item as a whole? No. Excellent. It's almost too much planning even for me today, because I've been doing this since about 9 o'clock, it seems, in various formats. So do we have any other areas of business at all? None of you dare put up your hand, you scurvy dogs. Right, brilliant, awesome. In that case, folks, thank you very much for your efforts this afternoon, and put it up with my lame dad jokes, particularly the one at the end. So I'll close the meeting. Thanks so much, folks. Stay safe now.
Thank you, Chair.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you.